Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our first inaugural webinar. Before I toss it over to Daryl, who is our chief and lead advisor here at D2, I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. So, where can you find more from us? You can take a look at d2sup.com, where all of our past webinars, this one included, will be archived there, as well as our YouTube channel and so on. If you have questions for Daryl, today's topic has to do with dealing with the disruptive board member in our board meetings. Any questions, put them through. I'll be keeping track of them for Daryl, and we'll do a Q&A once he walks us through the topic. So, without further ado, throw it over to Daryl.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Appreciate that, and thanks for all you people out there that have come to visit this webinar. We often talk about the importance of board meetings and how important they are to be as effective and productive as possible. Well, there are disruptions, undoubtedly, that are caused at board meetings, and today we're going to discuss one of them, and that is the board member that is dominating a board discussion items. We've often have heard that happen before, and I've lived it more than once in my board journey. And it's arguably the most, item that's been asked about more frequently than others when I'm doing presentations to boards. How do we deal with this situation? And there are ways to deal with it. But first, let's talk about why is the board meeting so important? It's arguably the most important governance activity of any board of directors. And it is the responsibility, quite frankly, of the board to ensure that the meetings are effective and that everything that's captured at the meetings are accurate and recorded in the board minute meetings. Many donors, and this is something that many board members neglect, many donors will look at the board as determining whether it's functional enough to warrant its support. And if it isn't, or it starts to go the other way, they will withdraw their support, and I have seen that happen as well. So board meetings are that important, and they need to be as accurate as possible. The minutes of those meetings can be held for legal challenges, for example. They can be brought into a court of law, so they need to be very accurate and will consider everything that's been discussed at the board meeting. And you must realize that the board meeting is the only governance avenue, where all key decisions and key activities are discussed, voted upon, and agreed to prior to being exercised. So now let's talk about what are some of the areas that I will cover in this particular webinar around the disruptive board member. I'm going to talk about what happens when it does occur and the impact it has to the rest of the board. And it does have a very significant impact. I'll also discuss why it happens in the first place. And then I'll finalize it with what are some corrective activities that you can put in place to make sure that it's mitigated and or eliminated as quickly as possible. And I'm going to finalize my presentation with a real life example. I have many of them, but I'll just provide one of them for you to show you what had happened and what the impact was to the board. So let's talk about why is these things happening in the first place? Well, generally speaking, when a board member is dominating discussion, he's being or she's being allowed to do so because the board chair has not addressed the situation or it's not addressed it effectively. The board chair is ultimately responsible for facilitating the board meeting. And in that facilitation, they need to ensure that every single board member has an opportunity to speak on every single action item that's on the agenda and needs to shut it down if that's not happening. Another area that I've noticed in many boards is that they do not have a governing policy around board meetings that they can refer to. A governing policy will outline the respective expectations and responsibilities of the key stakeholders of a board meeting. And the key stakeholders are the board chair, who has distinct responsibilities facilitating the board member and board meetings and dealing with these situations. Also, there's the board member themselves who have responsibilities to be prepared for the meeting, and also when they're at the meeting to be respectful of each other's point of view. And then there's the executive director. And the executive director has responsibility to ensure that all the information has been disseminated well in advance of the meeting so the board is prepared for all the discussions. Now, during the situation that happens is that a board member will take a particular situation or ongoing situations in agenda items and speak on an ongoing basis, almost to the point of exhaustion, quite frankly, on a particular item. Now, they do this for a variety of reasons, and it's the board's chair's responsibility to find out why this is happening. In some cases, they are very passionate about the subject matter that they are discussing, and so much so they want to get their position across to the rest of the board as distinctly as possible. Sometimes that takes a lot of discussion on their part to do so. There are other times where they are or think they are a subject matter expert. And as a subject matter expert, they want to make sure that the board members understand what they understand, and they spend an awful lot of time discussing that particular situation. There are times where a board member is just a dominating personality. It's just the way they are. They need to be talking frequently and at length on a particular item or items on an ongoing basis. And finally, there could be a situation where the board member has personal issues that's causing them to be a little bit more disruptive than norm and speaking on an ongoing basis that maybe typically they wouldn't do. Whatever the reason is, it's the board chair's responsibility to get to the bottom of it and to find out why this is happening and to make the corrective action as quickly as possible, because it can have adverse impact. For example, if the board is being disruptive as a result of this or any other activity, it could cause a reputational risk to the organization and to the board in particular. And also, it could cause risk to receiving donor support. If a donor does not see that the board meetings are being done on an appropriate level and that they are fully functional, then they may withdraw their support in part or in whole. And that's something that's very, very important, as I spoke to earlier. And you need to keep that in the back of your mind when you are facilitating a board meeting. The other issue is that there are board members that are going to become very, very frustrated with the dominating board member, to the point that they'll become disengaged in board discussions, and they'll be just sitting there and then questioning themselves of why they even bother to show up. They become more and more frustrated, and eventually they'll even quit the board or leave before their term is up. And it's very difficult to acquire new board members that want to be there. So it's very important that the board members you have, that they understand their responsibilities, and everybody is working as a cohesive team during the board meeting process. Let's talk about some corrective action that you can put in place. And these are very simple, and they would be documented in the governing policy that you should have. Now, the first thing is, if the board member is being disruptive at a board meeting and dominating that discussion, the board chair needs to deal with that right there at the meeting by calling on that board member to say, okay, thank you very much for your presentation and what you have discussed here. Now I would like to hear from the rest of the board. And go around and speak to every other board member and ask for their particular input into that subject matter. This will do one of two things. It's going to keep the other board members engaged, hopefully, and it's going to send a message maybe to the dominating board member that he or she has been speaking too much on a particular matter. So you would do that every single time. If this persists and the board member has not addressed the issue and has refrained from speaking, then you are going to have to speak to that board member on a one-on-one following the meeting. And it wouldn't be immediately after the meeting. You would set up a prearranged meeting off-site, and you would discuss with the board member what the impact that he or she has caused with the other board members. And that is making the board meeting a little bit dysfunctional, and the decisions may be come into question because you're not getting the information from and feedback from all board members. Keep in mind that the more feedback you get from all board members, the better and more informed decisions are going to be made. And you don't want to be making a decision that you probably shouldn't have based on one or two feedback from a dominating board member or two. In that discussion with the board member, you would provide them with a copy of the governing policy on meetings, and you would go over his responsibility or her responsibility in the meetings and why they need to be respectful and what your expectations and the board's expectations are of that individual going in the meeting discussions. Now, if you do not have a governing policy for meetings, my recommendation is you do so immediately, because you need a reference point. If you do not have a reference point, it's very, very difficult to have a discussion with a board member without any particular policy or document to refer to. So that would be something that would need to be done immediately, and then you have that reference point. And every single board member gets a copy or should receive a copy of this governing policy, and it should be reviewed no less frequently than biannually, preferably every year. That way it keeps all those expectations at the forefront for board meetings. Now, if this persists even after that first meeting, and that particular board member is still dominating meetings, then you would have that second, and I would say second to last meeting with the board member, and you would go over the responsibilities and expectations from the governing policy one more time, but you would also refer directly to the areas where it would be corrective action if it's not being adhered to. So, for example, the disciplinary process, and that would be in the governing policy, very clear and concise. And you would bring that to the attention of the board member that if this persists, we will have to suspend you or dismiss you from the board, because it's more important that the rest of the board is functional and not at the detriment of one particular board member. Another way that you may be able to address the situation, if that board member happens to be a subject matter expert, have them make a presentation or a co-presentation with the executive director on the subject matter. This way, all the information that he needed or she needed to get out is done so during a presentation, and leave the rest of the board to ask questions and to provide feedback. That can be very, very applicable in subject matter expert situations, but if it's not a subject matter expert situation, I would not advise that that be done, just for the sake of moving the board member out of that situation. So those are the particular events that you would put in place for corrective action. And it's important that this be done as expediently as possible, because if it's allowed to go on, you possibly are going to lose board members. And as I will reiterate this, you need to ensure that not one or two people can cause the detriment of the rest of the individuals or the board. So it needs to be corrected as quick as possible. Now, I'm going to give you an example of what happened early on in one of my board director's journey. I just was newly elected to a board, and during the first several board meetings, 4 or 5 months, there was an individual or two, one in particular, that dominated just about every discussion. And my first reaction was that this individual was very knowledgeable, and maybe he was the person that had been on the board the longest and knew what was going on, and we could learn from him. And quite frankly, I did learn some things from him. But then I started hearing, as I was on the board a little bit longer, some grumblings from the other board members who were frustrated, obviously, that, making comments that here he goes again. Why do we even bother coming? He's going to be dominating the meeting, and the board chair doesn't do anything about it. And I was hearing that more and more frequently, to the point where the several board members stopped coming to the board meetings, and I was wondering why. And then all of a sudden we hear from the board chair that we had 2 resignations. And that was all a result of the board chair not dealing with that situation effectively, and probably not having a board governing policy in place to deal with it effectively. And that's not what you want to happen. You need to be able to deal with that as effectively and as appropriately as possible. So all disruptions that can impact the board meeting need to be corrected as soon as possible. And you need to have a governing policy to be able to refer to make sure that this is easy to do and that everybody on the board knows what their expectations are at board meetings. It's that important. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope this has been beneficial to you.
All right. Thanks, Daryl. Good as always. So, if anyone has any questions, I've been picking up a couple here today, and we're going to go through those and see if we can't get them answered. So, Daryl, I got a couple questions for you. Are you all ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So, first question. Robert's asking, I've tried confronting the first person, and I tried doing it gently. What do I do if they don't respond?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm going to refer to one of the comments that I made during my presentation. You need to have a governing policy, and I'm assuming that you don't. And the only reason I'm assuming that you don't is many boards that I work with have not had a governing policy for board meetings. And therefore, they didn't have a reference document that can make it easier for them to refer to. When you sit down with a board member and you discuss that reference document and the disciplinary action, if quite frankly, if they don't follow through, that really sends a message, and each board member should know what their expectations and responsibilities are using that governing policy document. So I encourage you, if you don't have that document in place, to have it created first before you meet with the board member in question again, because you need to have a reference document, and it will be a board approved policy, remember. So everybody on the board will have approved that policy, including him. And you would give a copy of that policy to everybody to have as a reference document. So then you can meet with that individual if it persists and refer to that policy.
So I think the key thing you're trying to get at here is that be clear, be very upfront with your expectation. Is that
absolutely
the key thing here?
Absolutely. That's why the government policy is in place in the first place. It sets the expectations in a very clear and concise manner. And I mentioned earlier in my presentation that it talks about the clear expectations of the three distinct stakeholders. The board chair has responsibilities in the board meeting that are very clear and concise. The board members have expectations and responsibilities of a board meeting, and being respectful and not dominating the meeting. And that's even put directly in that verbatim. That they do not dominate a meeting. They are respectful of each other's input. And the executive director obviously has impact to the board meeting. But they need to be, those responsibilities and expectations need to be as clear and as concise as possible. So there is no room for gray areas, to be quite frank.
So one of the other questions we got was, how many strikes should I put in my policy? How often should I allow this kind of behavior before some sort of action has taken place?
Again, in the disciplinary piece, it would say in the policy what the actions are. And usually and it's very clear and concise, and usually what I've seen in these policies is that the first action is the first meeting with the individual off-site separately to discuss the governing policy again, to review what the expectations are of the individual, and to discuss what has been happening and the impact it has had on the rest of the board. And that way the board, that particular board member, will know exactly what has happened and why he's been at this meeting. And I would also refer to the next course of action, which is part 2, and that is in a second meeting, if this persists, that the board member will be asked will be suspended potentially, or even terminated from the board, because there's no way that the board can operate functionally with one member dominating discussions on a continuous basis. So that would be clearly outlined in the governing policy.
All right. I think our last question for today is from Carl. He is saying, I'm the one being called the disruptive board member, but he feels he has a point. And he wants to know what he can do to feel heard on the board that feels he's giving a lot of his time to.
You know, that's a very, very good question, Carl. And I can say that there are many board members that I've been in touch with that are very passionate about being on a board and extremely passionate over certain areas that are being discussed on the board and want to get their point across. My suggestion is to have a discussion with your board chair well before the meeting to discuss that particular area and why you want to get that information across and need to speak to it. And the board chair may just put you in a position where you are actually presenting on that subject matter. If you present on that subject matter, that gives you the opportunity to give all the information that you want to get to the board, and rightfully so. And you can co-present even with the executive director if they were part of the presentation. And that way you've got your information off your chest to the rest of the board members. And then the other board members now can reflect on that information and provide feedback and even ask you questions. And that way it's a win-win for both parties.
Perfect. I think that covers it. So, is there any part of the courses that we offer and stuff, Daryl, that you think would cover more about this topic?
Yes, we have under D2, we have a very large content, and one of our packages of 17 is called How to Conduct Effective Board Meetings, and it addresses these issues. It will provide you with a written guide that you can review if you wish, and it also has a video that covers some of these points that we discussed today and others. And it even has some documents that you can use from day one, like a generic governing policy on board meetings to get you started, and some other documents like an agenda item and others that will help you bring your board meeting to the effective level that you want.
Thanks again, Daryl. It was a great topic as usual.
Thank you very much.
All right. So, folks, as Daryl said, head over to d2sup.com for anything else. Stay tuned here on our Facebook page as we will bring you the next webinar that's coming up. And if you do go to the website, we happen to have a free course right now that you can go and take. So check that out. So until next time, thank you very much, everyone, and we'll be seeing you soon.